we had a dance party on Saturday night. Did I hear it right? Like Manu, your housemate had COVID-19.
Yes.
Which is good because now you will have immunity.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, you can just go around and around.
Yeah.
I like your eyes.
Well, I didn't expect it. It like looks kind of bumpy. I like it.
So let me ask you this. So because we graduated, last October, I wondered for the past 6 months, have you encountered anthropology in your daily life, or at what point does it remind you about anthropology?
So I think what I found most fascinating about anthropology personally was kind of questioning gender dynamics, power dynamics, those types of issues, resistance and agency. Those were the topics that I was most interested in. And I think especially gender. And so even with COVID-19 happening, you see a lot of references back to gender and socially ingrained assumptions or things that we've accepted. So there have been 2 things, for example, that have come up in the news that I found particularly interesting. First of all, the fact that apparently a lot of the PPE equipment is generically made for like a large built white man, and so it's not properly fitted to women. So when it comes to masks or other types of equipment, or gloves, it kind of ends up putting women at risk because it's like completely built for men. And then another question, for example, or topic on the news has been the fact that in the UK, well, also in the US, but let's start with the UK, you have much larger number of BAME, so Black, Asian, minority, and ethnic people who working in the medical industry are dying at a greater proportion than their white counterparts or Western British counterparts. And so, yeah, so that also brings up the question, is that like a genetic factor? Is it a social factor? It's just really fascinating because there might be genetic reasons, maybe like one ethnicity of people or race of people have like lesser immunity, or I don't know anything about science, but there might be genetic factors, but I think that there are probably a ton of social factors as well. In the US and in the UK, I think when it comes to the general population as well, you have a much greater proportion of Black or ethnic minorities who are passing away. Reasons for that are also quite social. It's very clear that a lot of ethnic minorities are the ones who have to keep going into work when the rest of us are in lockdown. They're the truck drivers, the bus drivers, the garbage, like the people who, a lot of the key workers tend to be these minority people. So then they keep putting their lives at risk. As a result, are much more at risk of harm from the disease. And so it's these types of issues that are just completely fascinating and incredibly relevant to the world we live in right now.
I was looking at the news, is it today or yesterday, said that the number of deaths in the UK already higher than the death in Italy. Yeah. And it's saying we can't just look at the numbers. Also, as you said, the number of people who had coronavirus, white people versus non-white people. Yeah. It's not like they're much healthier or genetic or anything, but it's related to like our social fabric, social engineering, how it made it the way it is, rather than like taking the face value as it is. But there's so many different factors that contributed to the disproportionate of within those 2 different ethnic groups. Why are you laughing?
because you're completely correct, and it reminds me of a lot of conversations I've had with Lucy. I'm actually really curious about how she will respond to your questions, because we always have very different opinions. She's an anthropologist, but I think if you ask her in your interview, you'll see that she has much more evolutionary anthropologist opinions. And one of the things that I've found very interesting about the UK's response to COVID-19 is this really, really widespread British exceptionalism mentality.
What do you mean by British exceptionalism?
What I mean by British exceptionalism is that the UK saw what COVID-19 did in China, saw what COVID-19 did. So that's far away. And I understand that there's a lot of Western exceptionalism where they think that things happen in the East, but they won't happen in the West because the West is, I don't know, more better in their opinions, somehow immune to the issues of the East. But then it came to Italy, and they saw Italy just blow up in flames, and yet they didn't do anything. They saw Spain blow up in flames, yet they didn't do anything. And by blow up in flames, I just mean that it clearly had a really large scale impact and death toll in Italy and Spain. Saw France do a very dramatic lockdown and still didn't do anything. And Boris Johnson tried to do the herd mentality tactic, which was clearly not a very intelligent tactic given the other countries that had gone beforehand. I don't know in what world he thought that somehow the UK would be able to survive herd mentality as a tactic, like a strategy, which just a name for doing nothing really. And that's what British exceptionalism is. They think that somehow they will avoid it. And even as everything was going on, the UK was not testing as much. So as a result, their death numbers were, the COVID numbers were much lower than the rest of Europe. But I had friends who would say, oh, the UK's COVID, is dealing with COVID so much better than Germany. But then if you read the news, they were always saying Germany's doing a great job, the UK isn't. Why? Because Germany was testing, mass testing. And so you had accurate numbers being compared to inaccurate numbers. And it's that mentality that just kind of sees the positives without questioning it. And that's what I find British exceptionalism to be. To be fair, I think all countries have exceptionalism mentality. Like, I don't think you can deny that. Obviously, the US obviously has it. I'm sure China definitely has it. Japan definitely has it. Every country has it. Some countries are much more vocal and kind of domineering in their expression of it. With the UK, I've just found it interesting how much I've seen it unquestioned, even among British friends, within the news, and for example, their response to COVID-19, I think was a very clear example of British exceptionalism. Another example that I saw is that British people really like to distinguish themselves from the US, and they think, the US has so many issues. The US is so sexist. The US has so many issues with race. The US has homophobia. The US has religious issues. We don't. Gender is not an issue in the workforce in the UK. There's this distinction where they think that they're clearly so much further ahead or progressive than the US. And I may be wrong, who am I? I'm not an expert on this, but as a objective bystander, these are the two countries that are quite similar to each other. I find it, even their leadership is quite similar, aesthetically and politically.
Big brothers, basically.
Yeah, I think they must be long lost twins or something.
You are French Iranian, right? If you have to compare the way different countries handle COVID-19, anything you observe?
I think it's a very interesting question because the UK, as you said, it has been quite chill. In Iran, you've got a really bad situation where you have a lot of sanctions, you have very, very high inflation, you have very little access to, even before COVID-19, little access to medication because of the sanctions. You have bad governance from the inside, no help from the outside. And then because of all these factors, the political, the economic, both domestic and international, you've got really high unemployment rates. Everything has become incredibly expensive, as I said, very high inflation rates. And the issue that comes with that is that you're not only dealing with the risk of COVID-19, but also the risk of famine, poverty, just survival. And so as a result, I think on April 11th, the government actually relaxed its lockdown measures, because without the economy running, people literally can't survive.
Has the infected numbers in Iran, has it decreased?
Apparently it had decreased, but today, literally before our call, the media had been sharing that it's spiking up again. And then you also have to understand that I don't think Iran's testing mass testing. I don't think Iran's government response is the most reliable government response. So we also don't know the full detail, but the numbers are spiking again, and I think it's one of the most hit countries in the Middle East.
And do you think the reason the government decided to kind of lift a bit restrictions is because they can't afford to have the economy stagnant for further, not because it has really gone better, but because you said all the complicated issues, kind of influencing people's livelihood, so you can't afford to do that. It's kind of similar thing what people who are protesting in the US are saying. But you look at that extreme version in Iran is which way you should there's a trade-off.
Exactly. How do you die, by famine or by COVID-19? I think my experience of Iran is quite cushioned. I never saw famine as a potential threat, but it's not that like a poor country. It's not like people are impoverished in that sense. But yeah, of course, if the prices have become so inflated, and then the value of your money, the value of the Iranian currency, even when I was a child, had no value, and then it's become even less value and less value and less value. And so even if they're trying to purchase international things, it's exorbitant. So in the end, yeah, it's kind of, there's no positives.
And good luck to our quarantine life in the UK. I hope this ends soon.